Welcome back, AP. All right, so loved what we got into within class on Friday. Yeah, we were together Friday, right? Loved how we got into the Aztecs, talking about how they're actually a very sophisticated, organized government. They had a sophisticated, organized method of farming on top of water, genombas. They had social class systems and a feudal system, and the only reason that they were not as developed as the Spanish that were incoming was due to the fact that they lacked forged metals and also domesticated animals, right? We talked heavily about Aztec religious sacrifice. We talked heavily about a lot of different ideas and how they were actually considered the Mexica Empire, not actually necessarily considered just the Aztec Empire. And a lot of that, of course, having to do as well with their takeover of other areas in the Mexico region, some of the former Maya civilization city-states, and how they would actually take, for taxation purposes and also holidays, prisoners from these other places that would then be sacrificed to their gods, right? Right? And they would do that, point it to the sun to actually give honor to their sun god for good harvests for the year, right? So we talked all about this stuff, and the reason why I go so in-depth with the Aztecs in particular is because I think it is important for us to get away from these false narratives, right? These false narratives that people have been spouting for years where it's like, well, the Aztecs thought that, Cortez was just a sentinel of their white snake god, Quetzalcoatl, right? Like, which is not actually true, right? There has always been a myth that the Aztecs believed that the incoming conquistadors were actually gods and blah, 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 which they actually did not believe that, right? Now, they did, we do know some things, though. We do know that the Aztecs were aware of the Spanish presence. They were aware that they had weapons that they had never seen. They were aware that they floated on what they would refer to as, floating castles, right? That they were on these huge ships, that they had guns, that they could use just a few of them to take out hundreds of thousands of people, and that also there were diseases sweeping through coming from these people. And Moctezuma, the leader of the Aztecs, was highly, highly aware of this, and he knew that he had to try and figure out a way to possibly bridge the gap between the Spanish and the Aztecs before they showed up and burned their entire civilization to the ground, right? So just so you understand, Hernan Cortez, very important figure in European history when it comes to exploration and actually coming into contact with these other civilizations. But just so you know, Hernan Cortez's original mission was supposed to be recon. He was supposed to be doing reconnaissance, as in going out for the Spanish government, checking on everything, finding out how big the Aztec Empire was, how big the Mexica Empire was, and if they were going to be a considerable threat, right? Now, the second he docks off in Mexico, he decides to just say, throw out the original plan of recon, and let's make sure we're making this more about gold and conquest. So he burns his own ships in the harbor. Now, of course, a lot of this may be due to the fact that he actually possibly killed the guy that was originally supposed to have the job in front of him. A lot of this may be due to the fact that he might have been a little bit more sadistic in the idea of trying to force his soldiers, those 600 men, into a very adverse situation of going up against these Aztec people. But one crazy thing happened is after he burned his vessels and after he acquired 2 interpreters, a man with a couple of different slaves behind him arrives out of the woods, right? And this is what we're getting into, this concept of the gifts, right? And what I mean by the gifts is this Aztec warrior with slaves in tow showed up out of the woods, and Cortez had no clue where the Aztec people were located or where Tenochtitlan was, but this man shows up and he bears gifts, right? He has jaguar pelts, honey, feathers, precious jewels, and also a small amount of gold, right? And with these gifts, Hernan Cortez is looking at all this stuff, and he's like, oh, wow, the Aztecs must be loaded, right? But they were gifts sent by Moctezuma, hoping to create a decent trade negotiation and relation between the two, and also possibly hoping that once these gifts had been received, maybe the Spanish would turn around and leave, right? Well, they didn't. Because then Hernan Cortez asked his interpreter, how much gold do we think they have? And then he turned and asked this Maya woman who spoke Maya and Aztec, how much gold do we think they have? And then she interpreted to the Aztec, and then it telephoned its way all the way back down. And the message that Cortez heard and received was that they had a massive amount of gold back in Tenochtitlan, right? Well, Cortez is going to abuse this dissension within the Mexican Empire, right? Because he now has this idea that the Aztecs are loaded. So he decides, look, we only have 600 men. We have 600 men, we have a handful of horses, a couple of cannons, and some guns, right? Could we possibly take out a city of 1 million people? Statistically, this is not actually working out for you, right? The chances, it doesn't matter what technology you have. Guns, metal, armor, doesn't matter, right? 600 men against a possible 1 million people in Tenochtitlan is not probably going to work out well for you, and you're all going to end up dead. So what Cortez decides to do is he starts deciding to go to the different cities within the Mexican Empire that the Aztecs had been taking sacrifices from for years. Because those people the Aztecs took over hated the Aztecs, right? They were like, we don't want to be a part of this empire, but they have these obsidian weapons that we can't beat. Well, then who shows up? The Spanish, who have metal weapons that can crush an obsidian one any day of the week, right? And so they start recruiting a small militia from those cities. And they acquire an army, basically, of 200 Spanish soldiers while leaving some of the men behind, right, to just stay on shore. 200 Spanish soldiers, 2 interpreters, and 6,000 angry natives that hate the Aztecs with a fury, right? And eventually they show up, and also what you're going to see right now as well is you're going to see Montezuma. He goes by both names, Monte or Mocta. All right, so Moctezuma or Montezuma. And also they have a theocratic government where they believe that he is a part of their religious system and that he is like a god on earth himself. But when the Spanish show up with 6,000 natives, 200 Spaniards, and 2 interpreters, and a bunch of horses, the Aztecs are super freaked out because they've never seen a horse before. They've never seen guns before. They've never seen, like, all these weapons and iron swords and steel that the Spanish are carrying with them. And Moctezuma's like, okay, what's our best plan? Let's welcome them in, right? And so the Moctezuma and all the Aztec warriors begin to welcome the Spanish into the city and allow them to start touring and looking around. But eventually, they begin to talk about trade. And Cortez begins to talk about, well, we want to delve in your gold, and we also want to share with you our Christian faith. And Moctezuma's like, well, we don't really need Christianity. I've never heard of this guy you're talking about named Jesus before. So maybe we're not going to do that, and maybe we'll talk about trade instead. And then Cortez says, how dare you insult my faith? And he takes Moctezuma hostage, right? And he brings Moctezuma out on a balcony above this huge pyramid in the middle of Tenochtitlan and says to the people, if you do not turn over all of your gold to me right now, I will kill your leader, Moctezuma. And the Aztecs look at each other and they're like, wait a second, Moctezuma is supposed to be a god. How is he letting them do this to these people? This must mean he's not really a god. So the Aztecs themselves begin to pick up rocks and other weapons and hucking them at their own king. And Moctezuma dies from getting nailed in the head with a rock, right? So Cortez and the Spaniards and the natives get driven out by the Aztecs. Oh my gosh, this is a huge moment in history. The Aztecs, the Native Americans of this area, just drove out a conquering Spanish force. Whoa, that's insane. But when the Spanish arrived originally to talk to Moctezuma, many of the other Spanish soldiers began to kind of walk around and mill around through the city. And what did they have with them? Smallpox, measles, influenza, right? And it ends up decimating a huge part of the Aztec population. And so also smallpox was present before the Spanish ever even got there, right? Because of other Spaniards coming into contact with other natives and other natives coming into contact with other natives, and then a chain reaction of it eventually leading up to the Aztecs. But smallpox decimated their population, and Cortez returned with a bigger native army and the rest of the men that he left behind, those 400 left behind, and he takes over the entire city, right? And he burns a large portion of it to the ground, rips all of their religious idols down, and destroys and lays havoc to the entire city, and then steals every scrap of gold that they have. So now we're seeing the Spanish infiltrate some of these large native groups, right? Now we're going to see another guy show up, Cortez's cousin, Francisco Pizarro, right? So Cortez's cousin is going to be active mainly in Peru. And he's going to be going up against the people you know of as the Inca, right? So go ahead and jot that down. Pizarro versus the Inca, right? So the Spanish also hear that there is not only one large-based civilization in like South America or / Central America with the Aztecs. There's a second one, and they're huge, and they're over in Peru. They have a massive civilization built on top of the Andes Mountains, right? So you've heard about the Inca before, and you probably don't even realize it. But to give you some geographical sense of where these people are, the Inca are located in South America, particularly coming out of this area of Peru, but they expanded all the way into Ecuador, all the way down towards Bolivia, and they were a massive, massive empire of people. They had over 10,000 miles of trade roads, right? The Inca were very, very large. The Inca sustained themselves on great agricultural standards, which we'll talk about here in a second, and some of the things that they grew. But the Inca were super sophisticated, right? Very, very sophisticated group of people, right? The Inca also heard of the Spanish approach, and they also were having a huge issue on their hands as well, but they were still a sophisticated group in and of themselves. They had all these trade routes, and they had another animal that they could domesticate, which we'll talk about here in a second. But even though they had 10,000 miles of trade routes, and even though they knew how to build cities on top of mountains, right? This one being Machu Picchu, right? So that they could do all of these things and had grandiose architecture and had a very sophisticated infrastructure with the social hierarchy system, and also had nobles and priests and all this other stuff. They unfortunately weren't as, like, they were lacking one thing. They didn't have a system of writing, which was actually mind-blowing, right, to a lot of people. Because the Aztecs had a system of writing, the Maya had a system of writing, but the Inca actually never developed a system of writing. They actually used these things to actually, like, in place of a system of writing. Because 9 times out of 10, systems of writing are created to actually keep track of agricultural yields, right? How much did you grow this season? How much will we need next season? Will we be able to survive the winter, et cetera, et cetera? That's usually where writing comes from. So in a sense, record keeping. However, this right here is the closest thing that the Incas ever came up with writing, and they're called quipus, right? And these quipus are these little threads where every single knot means a certain number of something, right? So without these quipus, the Incas never would have been able to trade or keep track of their agricultural yields, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the disgusting, nasty little animals that they could breed, right? So, excuse me. That is a llama, right? So the Inca people could domesticate a llama, right? They had 2 domesticates. So remember how we talked about how the Aztecs could have been an empire that rivaled the Spanish and had the ability to push them back and would have been unconquerable. And maybe, who knows, maybe the Aztecs would have had voyages over to Africa and actually started like interacting with the Spanish there long before Columbus ever. Can we imagine that for a moment? That if the Aztecs had forgeable metals and domesticatable animals, and more domesticatable plants, they could have possibly interacted with Europeans, and Columbus would have never had to try and fight a trade route because there would have literally just been an interaction between the Aztecs and the Europeans, which could have maybe been more possibly peaceful, right? It's just wild when you think about it, how history just didn't turn out the way it turned out could have been so much different, right? But as we know, the Aztecs could only domesticate dogs and turkeys, and they had some domesticatable crops like squash, beans, corns, things like that. The Inca had this domesticate animal, right? This is a llama. And the llama was served as a solid beast of burden for them, because you have to understand, technological development for the Europeans, with them having iron and bronze and steel and guns and trade ships and all this other stuff, a lot of that does hinge on ancient history, because thousands and thousands of years ago in Southwest Asia, known as the Fertile Crescent now, you saw the domestication of large beasts of burden. Things like ox and cattle and larger animals that could plow fields or carry large loads. Well, the problem with the llama here is that the Inca would have loved to have had a beast of burden that could have done a lot more, but llamas can only carry like 60 pounds, like give or take, right? So they're good, and they did a lot of positive things for the Inca, providing wool and providing some like heavy labor, but not a ton, right? So again, this limited the Incan technological growth. The only other domesticatable animal that the Inca had was actually guinea pigs, right? So they had guinea pigs as well, which they would like actually eat as well. Sorry, guys. If any of you has a guinea pig at home, I apologize. Don't go look at squeakers and be like, "Oh, die!" Like, so you don't have to be like that. And a lot of y'all actually know a little bit about the Inca already. The Inca are prominently exposed in the famous Disney movie, The Emperor's New Groove, which is one of my favorites. Absolutely hilarious. That's why he gets turned into a llama. And also, just so you know, the king, right, the figure, the main character in The Emperor's New Groove is named Cusco. That's actually because the capital city of the Incan Empire was known as Cusco, right? Machu Picchu was just their biggest religious area. Now, this right here, also very interesting of the Incan people, they had a very sophisticated farming technique. So we talked about 2 seconds ago how the Inca were all the way up in the Andes Mountains on super high elevated plains. Well, the thing about it is they had to figure out ways to farm in mountainsides. So they developed this, and it's called terracing, right? They would cut notches into the mountains themselves and then create flat areas to actually farm on top of. And they farmed things like quinoa, other types of grain, and the big one, potatoes. Potatoes are actually from Peru. That is where they are originally from, right? So, no, the Irish potato famine did not happen before the Europeans came into contact with the Inca. They had to happen, the Irish potato famine had to happen after because the Irish didn't know that potatoes existed before the 1500s, right? So the big thing about it, though, is potatoes are from Peru. Fun fact, right? Now, speaking also, though, some of you are like probably just raising your hand. You're like, Mr. Terry, do they sacrifice people? You know what, Lauren Gross, that is a great question, right? And the Inca actually did. It's a very commonality, like folklore thing between a lot of these Native American cultures is the aspect of ritual sacrifice, right? Now, this is how the Incas sacrifice people, though. The Inca would sacrifice children, okay? They would typically sacrifice children, usually young women, right? Young female children, because they believed that they were pure and closer to God, right? And also, the way they would sacrifice them is pretty intense. Whereas the Aztecs would cut your heart out, rip it, or would cut you open, rip your heart out with their bare hands, hold it up to the sun and go and let it do that, and then kick you down the steps of the temple. The Inca didn't do that. The Inca sacrificed people in like a private ceremony, right? The Inca would actually give a child coca or alcohol to kind of get them like a little like off kilter and a little out of their own kind of mindset. And then they would take them high up into the Andes Mountains, and they would either strangle them to death, or they would actually, or they would hit them repeatedly because it was believed that the soul was inside of the head and that would actually be able to be released into the afterlife. So it's like a very, very intense thing. And also the Incas' big thing about them is they did not believe in cremating bodies. So they didn't believe in burying them in that sense or cremating them. They believed in leaving them out, or else, so that way the body was whole as it went into the afterlife. They thought that cremating a body was a huge like sin in and of a sense of their community. So what ended up happening is we have found some of these sacrificed children. This mummy, this female Incan sacrificial mummy, is hundreds of years old, and she was perfectly preserved in the cold tops of the Andes where the atmosphere is also thinner. How cool is that, right? That's wildly awesome. I'm sure for a fact right now, at least one of y'all is like, wow, that's really, really interesting. And you're after this going to go look up Incan mummy sacrifice, right? So anyway, but interestingly enough, though, also, these are the people that this guy is going to come in contact with, right? The Inca were very sophisticated, right? Very sophisticated. They had domesticatable animals, not very large ones. They had domesticatable crops, not very plentiful ones. The one thing they also lacked, though, was forgeable metals, right? All Incan weapons that they are going to come into contact with are still not even as advanced as the Aztecs ones. The Incans would actually use clubs and rocks and like improvised axes and things like that, or they would use this thing called a not a trebuchet, but a it's a flail. It's got 3 rocks on it and a rope, and you swing it and throw it. It starts with a T, and I can't remember what it's called, and it's going to drive me nuts if I don't look it up real quick. Weapon, 3 rocks on rope. What's it called? Oh, Ebola, right? So, yeah. Ebola. That is what it's called. Ebola. Not Ebola, right? Yeah, South American Indian weapon. How do you like me now? All right, now, anyway, but Ebola. I thought it started with a T for some reason, but it doesn't, so it's okay. Now, but that's the guy that's going to come into contact with this man, right? So that was Pizarro that we just looked at, and he is also going to show up with a small invading reconnaissance force of only a couple of hundred Spaniards, and they are going to have a few cannons with them, some guns, and they're also going to bring with them a priest, which is a big thing as well that they brought with them. But this is the man that they're going to have to come into contact with. Whereas Cortez came into contact with Moctezuma, Pizarro is going to come in contact with Atahualpa, right? Atahualpa, Atahualpa, right? There he is, right? So the Inca, when Pizarro shows up, were very weak from civil war and disease. So Atahualpa was actually fighting a massive war with one of his relatives to try and figure out who was going to be the next king of the Inca, right? Because their father or like relative died, and there was a dispute over who was going to actually be the leader of the Inca, right? And since Atahualpa won that civil war, it was believed that he himself, again, was also like a godlike figure, and the gods believed that he was supposed to be in charge, right? But he was also dealing with another problem. They were being decimated by smallpox, right? So not only was Atahualpa losing men from a civil war, but his kingdom was also very weak due to this disease, right? But still, all the same, Atahualpa believed that, I've heard rumors about these Spaniards. I heard they have these weapons that I don't believe they have, because no one could have sticks that produce lightning and thunder and kill people, right? And I also don't believe that they're just a couple of hundred of them are going to be able to take out my military, right, which is thousands strong. So Atahualpa decides to set a trap for the Spaniards, right? And Atahualpa sends word to the Spaniards to meet him at a city in the Incan territory called Cajamarca, right? Cajamarca, right? And so what he ends up doing is he decides to tell the Spaniards, like, look, you meet me at this square, and I will show up, and we will discuss with each other the understanding of how you're going to, basically, in his mind, surrender, right? So we got the Battle of, there it is, Battle of Cajamarca. So there we go. And so as they show up, they all show up in this giant square inside of this city. But the crazy thing about it was that actually ended up happening. Where are you at? Where are you at? Man, I don't see the picture I want to, like, actually use. But anyway, what ends up happening is at this very, very intense battle scene, the Spaniards decide, oh, well, we're going to set a trap for Atahualpa instead. And what they do is there's a giant square, right? This big, big square that exists on Cajamarca. And they decide, look, we're going to hide our Spanish forces around the edges of the square itself. Like, I tell you what, how about I draw it for you a little bit, right? So what they decide to do is they're going to go like, all right, here is the square of Cajamarca, right? Atahualpa is going to have to come in through this direction, so we'll hide guys here and here and here and here and here, and we'll hide them in the trees off the edge of the square and in these buildings so he won't be able to see us, right? And so Atahualpa shows up to Cajamarca with a giant military in tow, right? Over 1,000 people strong to go and have a fight with only a couple of hundred Spaniards, right? And we actually have firsthand information and evidence of this event in history actually occurring, which is super, super cool. And what apparently ends up happening is Atahualpa shows up on what is known as a litter, right? Not litter as in a litter box for your cat. A litter as in a big structure where 6 men are holding a big, what looks like a stretcher kind of, and then Atahualpa is sitting on a chair above their shoulders, right? So like a tabletop, and they're carrying it in like this, and Atahualpa is sitting on top of it, right? And they walk their way into this square with a huge number of guys, but here's the problem. The dudes that are showing up with Atahualpa, his military, all they have are rock-based weapons, cloth armor, and nothing else to show for it, right? Because they don't believe that the Spanish are going to be a legitimate threat, right? And when they show up with Atahualpa, their god king on this litter, all of a sudden, the first Spanish person to go and interact with Atahualpa is a priest, right? He walks up, and of course, what does this priest have? Where is this again? Where is this again? Gold God glory, right? We believe that the Spaniards are trying to use this kind of Christian, like, conversion idea as being like, oh, if you don't convert to Christianity, then we have the right to use violence against you, which is very, very extreme and over the top. But apparently this priest walks up to Atahualpa, and he's like, oh, you need to take the Lord Christ's name into your heart, and hands Atahualpa a Bible. Let's back up for a second. He's Incan. even if he could read, because they don't have a written language in the Incan culture, he can't read Spanish or Latin, which is what this thing's going to be written in, right? And so he looks at this thing and he flips the pages and he goes, huh, and he throws it onto the ground. And then at that moment, the priest says, "You have disgraced our God. Men, attack!" And they basically sound this alarm, and they start ringing bells really loud, and they start firing off cannons left and right, and they scare the Incas so bad that they all try to scatter, and they drop Atahualpa to the ground, right? And Atahualpa's laying on the ground trying to defend himself, and literally the Spanish show up, and they kill over several hundred of these Incan people in cold blood with swords and guns, and chase them down and trample them with their horses. It is absolutely wild. But if you want to look up some more stuff about it, it is called the Battle of Cajamarca, and it's a very, very cool story. But what they end up doing is they take, They take Atahualpa hostage also, just like they did with Moctezuma, right? And they go back to the Incan capital of Cusco, and they decide to put Atahualpa up for ransom. They tell his entire city, "You need to give us X amount of gold and we won't kill your king," right? They ransom him. The Incans pay it. And then the Spaniards decide to kill him anyway, right? They say that you have not taken our Lord name, God, blah, 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 blah. And they decide to actually execute Atahualpa even after the Incans have agreed to fill rooms full of gold for them, right? Literally, Atahualpa was like, "We have so much gold, we don't even know what to do with it all." And they literally did. Look at this thing. This is the temple of the sun god in Inca, reproduced from what we believe that it looked like at its height. It was covered wall to wall in gold, and Atahualpa's people actually paid that ransom, but they killed him anyway. And they killed him in a very malicious way. They forced him to convert to Catholicism. They gave him a Christian name, and then they actually used this thing called, not the strapada, but they used a device, right? And hold on, what is the thing called? Why can't I remember what these things are called? Execution of Atahualpa. There it is. They used a device to strangle Atahualpa to death, right? And he was executed by, what's it called? It said the G, I think. There it is, a garrote, right? So they used this device to actually execute Atahualpa, which is a very, 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 very terrible device that is actually where a lever pulls back on a leather strap, and they ended up strangling Atahualpa to death. And then adding insult to injury, they then cremated Atahualpa's body, which in his faith is a huge insult, because their religion believes that his soul will now not actually go on to the afterlife. Right? So they executed him, and then the Spaniards, because of taking over the Inca, are going to stumble upon an immense fortune of gold and silver. And this means, for 2 seconds, that if the Spanish discovered gold and silver in South America, that must mean that there is a plentiful amount of it, right? A huge, vibrant, gigantically plentiful amount of this gold. We got one more slide and we're done, okay? Now, but the big thing is that the Spaniards, now that they have found out that there's gold in Mexico, that there's gold in South America, that now they want to set up colonies, right? So then the Spanish start to show up following Pizarro and following Cortez, and they begin to show up and set up colonies all throughout South America and Mexico, right? These colonies were divided into little principalities called viceroyalties, and every single viceroyalty had a governor that was elected, or a viceroy that was elected to lead each of these provincial areas, right? And what is going to be the way that they use these things to make money? Silver and gold is going to be a big one, right? They're going to start digging mines and actually mining the silver and gold out. They're also going to start planting a crop there that grows crazy well in South America, as well as the Caribbean islands, sugarcane. So they start farming sugarcane, they start ranching livestock. But here's the question: the Spanish don't have that many people. How is it going to be possible for the Spanish to mine silver and gold mines, farm sugar, plant this sugar, harvest the sugar, process all of it, and curate a livestock industry? Well, they can't. And I know a lot of you right now are probably saying, like, oh, is this when slavery becomes larger in the New World? No. They instate a system called the encomienda, right? And the encomienda system is literally where where the Spanish government, Isabella and Ferdinand, granted colonies, and also under Charles V at this time, granted colonies the right to force natives to work for free, right? It was literally free slavery. Because here's the plan. The encomienda plan was Spanish settlers will take care of the natives and we'll help them and we'll Christianize them. And that was the plan that was written down on paper, right? And that the Indians would work in a portion of for just a small portion of their time for the Spanish settlers, mining silver and gold and harvesting sugarcane. But in the reality of what happened, Spanish settlers forced huge long labor hours, days and days long, and if the natives refused, they could end up dying or having their family held hostage, right? They never paid any of these native workers. They failed to protect them from disease or any other Spanish colonials who could just kill them at any point if they felt like it. And they're also, every time the natives would die off in large numbers, the Spanish would just take their land, right? And so the Indians are going to die from disease. I hate saying Indians. The natives are going to die from disease and harsh living conditions and very harsh working conditions. And the encomienda is only going to end after clergy and protests and native revolt. But the abuses continue even after they actually replace the entire thing with this thing called the repartimiento, or after they replace it, right? And then they're eventually going to start bringing slave labor into the colonies. So the encomienda system was absolutely horrific, right? But man, that was a long flip, and I am sorry that was a long one, but it's a good one, and it's a lot of super interesting stuff, all right? But we're going to cut it there, okay? I hope y'all have a great weekend. We are going to review next week. We're going to play a game, and we're going to get into it, and we're going to make sure you're ready for your test, but I'll talk to you guys later on. Y'all have a good one.